My mother, who died when I was young, had left it known that she wanted me to be an engineer. And since I had very few opportunities to comply with her wishes since her death, I started out in engineering. The breakthrough day, I was sitting, it had to be spring, it was inordinately hot. I was in a non-air conditioned building, and there was a guy up in front of the class that had a giant slide rule held from strings on the ceiling, attached to the ceiling, and was telling we fledgling engineers how to use a slide rule. And I must have dozed off, because I got an eraser, blackboard eraser, felt one, right between the eyes. I woke up quickly. He kind of apologized, but said it was very irritating to have someone just fall asleep in his class. And if I had no more interest in that, in the program than that, maybe this wasn't the place I belonged. So I sat there for a few seconds. And I thought, you know, the guy's right. I got up, grabbed my books, and walked out past him. I said, "Thank you very much. You've changed the course of my life." And I was aware that the architecture building, School of Architecture, which was then in the old barracks over by the annex, where it was. And I'd been toying around with looking into it. I walked over there. It was magic. I walked in the building, I thought, I'm home. It was funky and disorganized, and there was kind of a hall where there were projects up on the walls, and then there was, you went up a few stairs to the office, and there was a lady there that was a legend back in those days. Her name was Johnny Edwards, and she was the secretary and everything else. And I said that introduced myself and said I thought I might be interested in going into architecture, but I wanted to see if I could talk to somebody about it. And she said, "Well, you can talk to Roger Bailey." Within a few minutes of being in the building, I'm sitting across the desk from Roger Bailey, who had to be one of the most magical human beings on the face of the earth. I mean, he was just this handsome, gray-haired, rugged, Abe Lincoln kind of guy. I walked out on cloud 9, and that was really the inception. I later found out that my mother, I think it was the family joke, what she meant by engineer was an engineer on the railroad. Somewhere in there, before school, I was interrupted by being called up as the National Guard unit to go to the Berlin crisis. That stretched into almost 2 years. I decided that, okay, if I'm really serious about this architecture thing, since I'd wasted an engineer, as I viewed it, wasted in engineering, I didn't want to kind of repeat that and be bouncing around forever trying to get an education up there. So I thought with my high school mechanical drawing skills, I might have some value in an office, and I could experience an office. And so I think I knocked on just about every door in town. I went to work finally for a guy. I knocked on his door too. His name was Stanley Evans. Stan Evans was a not tall man, stocky, very muscular, had a little office on 4th South over a coffee shop, as I recall. I made my pitch to Stan, and I was so desperate at that point in thinking that this was what I had to do. I said, you know, I just want this experience, and if I'll be happy to work for nothing and until I can or do become of value to you, if that would interest you in any way. And he looked at me like I was something that came in on my shoes, and said, "If I pay you nothing, then you're worth nothing, and that I don't need that. And I turned around to walk out thinking, okay. And he said, be here at 8 o'clock Monday morning. This was, I believe, on a Friday. And I was there. And we became dear, dear friends. I just valued the man so much. So I started architecture school. I was in the old 5-year program. I took rather naturally to it. Roger Bailey was there all the time, which was very useful. And there was a stellar faculty that I still remember a lot of the people there. I graduated in 66, had a wonderful summer, was a recipient of a Portland Cement Association scholarship that took, by now I'm married, in 64, which was really cool. And I was able to take my wife with me to France and the portions of Europe that we were able to travel. When I graduated in 67, a mentor on the faculty at that point, Stephen McDonald, had me working in his little office and studio at his home out in Mill Creek. I was still in school. The University of Utah hired a brilliant man from MIT by the name of David Evans, who sat over in the Merrill Engineering building and started a program called computer graphics. It was a cutting-edge program, one of the first in the nation, fed off the MIT program, and was incredibly well funded by the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the United States Air Force. David Evans saw significant application of computer graphics and architecture. I mean, it was just a natural. Steve, however politically it worked out in the architecture department, became the faculty member that headed up the joint research program between computer graphics and architecture. And I went to work for him for 18 months. So for that 18 months, I was hungry and anxious to get out and practicing architecture because that's what I really wanted to do. But I became a research assistant, and we did some pretty interesting stuff that wrote papers for ARPA and worked hand in glove with the computer graphics people that, well, and we all know that's where computer graphics as it is today, and now the computer programs that are applicable to architecture were born. I went to work for Edwards and Daniels and liked it a lot. Grew to know Ralph Edwards and Judd Daniels. Kind of worked under the wing of Judd Daniels. There were a lot of interesting people in that office at that time, and I think they were doing some really quite interesting work. I believe I was there close to 3 years. My wife and I bought kind of a wonderful old house up in, you could buy them for nothing those days, up on Wall Street, which was just south of the Capitol building. I started remodeling the house, and we did some interesting things with it, and there was a thing called the Women's Architectural League. Boyd Blackner's wife kind of was head of it, and they put our little Wall Street house on a home tour. Well, the house was kind of well, no, it was very interesting, I think, what we had done to it. And people responded favorably to that. A lot of people were coming through it. But what we had done with the garden, which was basically to structure the garden like a series of outdoor rooms, really struck people because you just didn't see much of that in Salt Lake. So all of a sudden I started getting these opportunities which to do gardens, and then you get involved in opening the house to the garden so it would lead into a small remodel. And there was a point still at Edwards and Daniels, but where I got over my head in debt on the Wall Street house, and I was working Edwards and Daniels during the day, at night working on these little garden projects and remodel projects. One day it dawned on me, I was billing a little more on my small projects by working weekends and nights than I was being paid at Edwards and Daniels, so I was dealing with my debt on the Wall Street house rather handsomely there, and I had more work than I could do, so I kind of put in my resignation at E&D. They were fabulous about it. Ralph and Judd remained friends over all the years. By now we sold the Wall Street house and bought a wonderful house which had been designed by Kletting, who was the architect of the Capitol. So here we were in this ancient Kletting house up on Haxton Place, and I had the whole basement. I sat down there and drew my little remodel projects, and then started doing the licensing. Somewhere in that period, it took a couple of tries, I got licensed. A good friend from Edwards and Daniels days, John Hewish, and I started a little, not a formal partnership, we did some projects together in a little building he had up on 6th Ave G Street. It was an old grocery store, and so we started pumping out little houses, and so I really started my career doing gardens, feeding into houses, working better with the gardens by opening them up, house remodels, and then moved into houses, and that kind of, God knows where I am date-wise there, probably crowding up into the early 70s. We started out doing the little things. We moved into the big things, houses. We had a predominantly residential-based practice in the early years, and we're doing a lot of work in Park City, which had been discovered as something other than an old dying mining town, and was was becoming the ski place that it is today, and the resort. John went one way, I went another, and I opened a small practice with a colleague also from Edwards and Daniels, and we bought an old building on South State Street, not too far south. We were right across from the City and County building. It was called the JENKINS SADDLERY, and it was a small hotel above, and then the old saddle shop on the bottom. We proceeded to redo that building for tenancy in the upper regions, and a couple of architectural firms moved into there. So we were kind of a little enclave of graphic designers. There was a stellar graphic design firm there, and then our little office too. Continued to do houses, and then early on some bigger projects started coming in that kind of fed off our work in Park City. The first Kimball Art Center, which was a modification of an old, literally an old gas station, but it was a large gas station, and that had even had roots that went back to stagecoach times, and that was the first kind of larger project. But then from there it moved into, I almost think of the practice in terms of where we were officed at the time. We moved from that building over to a wonderful old building off Exchange Place that was built during the First World War, intended to be a factory for fur-lined flight suits. They never managed to build a flight suit there. I think the story was that they could never quite agree on anything. We started working doing work up in Jackson Hole, and that grew into a small satellite office up there. And I spent a lot of time there. ended up doing a major resort up there that was housing based, 385 individual housing sites on the west side of the Snake River over near Teton Village. We were introduced through Stephen Goldsmith, who was starting ARTSPACE, to their programs and became kind of their in-house architect. In-house in that, I don't mean that we were in-house, we were there almost exclusively their architects, and they were just a superb client. So we spent a lot of time, the firm did, with affordable housing projects. And one of the last ones we did in the last few years was the first affordable housing project that was net zero, which was kind of unheard of.
Talk about the work that brought you the most satisfaction.
I think it was, looking back on it, I think that clearly the affordable housing component, because I felt like I was doing something other than just fancy houses. We did a lot of fancy houses, over 400 of them over the years. And I had the good fortune of dealing with employees and later partners who always, and I seriously mean always, put design as the driving motive in any good design, as we saw it, as the primary mover in any project. And so it was greatly rewarding from that standpoint. We started doing work for a house, actually. Lots of things grew out of the house projects. This gentleman had recently acquired a company here in Salt Lake City and was interested in remodeling a house, interestingly enough, on Old Haxton Place where our Cletting house was. And before we even got the house drawn, he had moved to another house and we started working on that. He subsequently, his company leased the David Keith Mansion on South Temple and had their headquarters there. In 1986, I think it was, there was a disastrous fire there that pretty well incinerated the interior of the building. No one was hurt, thank God. The morning after the fire, I'm standing in the ruins, still smoking, and my client said, "It can't be saved, but we're insured, so you might as well try and fix it." That was a great vote of confidence. It turned out to be the inception of a whole new world of architecture for our firm. Never our intent, my intent, our intent, partners at that point, to be in historical restoration. But the building was insured by Lloyd's of London for mega dollars, and so we commenced. When I look back on that, how little we knew and how unqualified we were to even begin to think about a project of this nature. But I knew a young man, Tim Hoagland, who was an incredible craftsman, contractor. Tim and I stood there and he said, "You know, Max," Tim was so bright and I was so dumb. And he said, "Max, I think there is such a thing as a conservator. There have to be conservators of architecture." And he said, I have a good friend that is a conservator at the Museum of Natural History. And he said, "Let's give her a call and see what's the next step? Well, what do you do, for example, with all of the leaded glass beveled leaded glass that was all, and all the woods that, some of which could be saved. Not to mention the Tiffany turned out wasn't Tiffany, but it was a Tiffany offshoot. The dome that was melted in fragments on the floor. We're literally walking on them almost. And so we called Anne at the Museum of Natural History, and she said, oh, indeed, there's a whole world of... So she gave us the name, and it was the historical entity that oversaw most of the historical monuments in the Northeast. He spent 45 minutes on the phone with Tim and myself telling us, we described where we were, what we were doing, what we had. By the end of this phone call, he had he said, I am sending, if you're willing, I will send our key conservator out. He sent the most incredible guy, gentleman by the name of Tom Gentle. What a guy. Tom was there within 2 days, but in the meantime, we had gone through the building, through instructions from Tom. We're isolating all of the hardware, putting a gel on them. We had sprayed gels on all the glass to stop the acidic soot. We were loading all the pieces of glass from the dome into boxes. The dome actually was put back together by, God love him, Willie Littig, who is a fabulous glass artist here in this city, and totally competent, working under the direction of Tom Gentle. So the dome is back the way it was. Anyway, that was the inception of our experience. So, how many years later? Doesn't seem like it was 10. Same damn thing happens to the governor's mansion. Same thing, right up through the middle. Leavitt was governor. Fortunately, everybody got out of there without harm or problem. But that was also, I mean, it was just the same thing. And Cumming went to bat for us with the State Building Board, because we had no experience with the State Building Board, and they were a tough outfit to satisfy. But in the Salt Lake Tribune, the article wasn't about the architect, but it mentioned that nationally renowned architectural firm has been put in place to do the... I loved that. Nobody knew us outside of... Well, we did a house, some houses in Maine. We did a house in the Puget Sound and houses, but how do you like that? Internationally renowned. So there were a lot of historical restoration projects. Then ARTSPACE started buying these warehouses, and so there was the historical component, but married to the creating new spaces, adaptive reuse we called it in those days. So we did a lot of adaptive reuse projects. Then we started doing some for private developers, and they were a blast. A lot of fun to do. The Dakota Lofts, for a wonderful team of Jim Lewis and Mike Martin, just creative guys as developers who were out there trying to figure out what was not just a new gimmick to sell a product, but how to do something that could be more interesting to the people that were going to live there rather than how they were going to sell them. So we did a number of projects with them. What became known as the J.G. McDonald Chocolate Factory, now known as Broadway Lofts. I'm not sure there's a lot of difference. At least there wasn't for us. But maybe we didn't change when we should have. I don't know. And I guess that is technology. I watched with a good friend who shared space with me in my other life, where I was doing after my retirement. doing conservation of rare and antiquarian books. Kind of got hung up on that conservation thing. So we had numerous conversations about that, and he kind of brought me up to speed on how whole systems are in packages technologically, and well, in the computer, and how architecture in his mind had become a matter of combining these things into a building. I guess truth is, I missed that whole part. I was starting to see it come in when I actually left the firm in 2008 and continued to consult just on ARTSPACE projects, but only on the design end, so how these things were kind of put together. But we were still doing it the old way, and I think apparently there is a new way, but you'd have to talk to somebody younger than me. Oh, there were some terribly disappointing buildings, and there are a few of them there, and I'm not going to identify them for the record because they're embarrassing. The unfortunate part of architecture, one of the unfortunate parts, unfortunate in many respects, is once you start riding that pony on one side of the stream, you got to ride them on through. And so, yeah, there were some disappointing buildings, disappointing projects. I was in my 70s when I did retire. But going back to one of the really positive things that had occasional disappointments in it was dealing with the people that I worked with. And for the most part, they were wonderful, positive experiences where I think it was almost a family in a way. And sometimes there were people there that didn't fit, and there were those moments that had to come where you came to grips with that, and some disappointing human relation events over those years. So I can't say everything was perfectly wonderful, but on balance it was no regrets. Yeah. Don't ever say you love architecture. I did, and it got me in trouble with my young wife. Architecture is not something to love. Architecture, it's just a misuse of the word, I think. But you can be and should be completely committed to it in the sense that, but keeping a balance. And I lost sight of that balance a number of times. And God love my wife. She went through those times with me, and we survived it. But it can really take a hold of you, and I think that that whole idea needs balance. So I would advise anybody going into today to keep a balanced life, and develop some business acumen. And I would advise anybody to do that. But I would encourage and have encouraged young people to go into architecture. But unless they're pretty committed to it, find another way to make a living, because it can be pretty draining. The profession can be a wonderful way to benefit humanity if you keep your eye on that, and that's what was so wonderful about ARTSPACE. You know, we always felt like we were not just making a beautiful house for somebody with a lot of money, but really impacting the world in a positive way, making the world a better place, hopefully even a more beautiful place. It can be a very rewarding, even monetarily, it can be rewarding if you do get and develop a sense of how to operate as a business. That came late for me, or I learned it as I went along, which is not the way to do it. But bring bring those elements into it, and you can have a rewarding emotionally and a rewarding financially career. Yeah. And it's a good thing we're not still putting ink on linen.